Welcome to opening night of the 8th annual Doc NYC Film Festival. You're in for a terrific evening. My name is John Vanko, and I'm the general manager of IFC Center, which produces this festival each year. Tonight's opening night film is something special. One of the most elegant and powerful things a work of art can do is to illuminate the present while ostensibly telling a narrative that's set entirely in the past. The final year, as its title implies, follows with remarkable access the Obama administration, circa 2016, as it pursues its goals in world diplomacy. This movie is not about the next administration. It's not about what's happening in the world today, but the great impact and resonance of the film comes when we, the viewers, who live under this new administration, who are swamped with the news of today, watch what happens on screen and consider the stunning distance that seems to separate today from just last year. For the past 7 years, as Doc NYC has grown, we've shown the work of hundreds of filmmakers telling important stories about the world we live in. Today, we as a culture, as a nation, desperately need those filmmakers to continue their work more than ever. We used to think that concepts like documentary, truth, news, fact, and science were shared among us, a set of norms that unite us. Now, those concepts somehow seem to divide us, and the guidance and confidence we gained from those norms seems to have disappeared. But filmmakers who go out to turn their cameras on the real world and bear witness to all the stories that can't be forgotten, to all the people who can't be ignored and the victims who can't be silenced, the filmmakers who make those films are vital in our being able to reestablish the norms, boundaries, and protections that our world needs to get back on track. So, thanks to all the filmmakers who are sharing their films with us here at Doc NYC this year. This festival couldn't have grown to where it is today without the hard work of the festival team, led by Executive Director Raphael Nehausen, Creative Director Tom Powers, Director of Programming Basil Tsiokis, Development Director and Doc NYC Pro Producer Deborah Rudolph, and Operations Director Dana Krieger. I want to thank them as well as the many, many others who work so hard to make this event a reality. And we never could have launched this festival without the continuing and enthusiastic support of the company behind IFC Center, AMC Networks. Jonathan Searing, Lisa Schwartz, and Josh Sapan have done everything I could ask to make possible the ambition and growth of Doc NYC, and I'm grateful for their unwavering support as well. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Basil Tsiokis, Raphael Nehausen, and Tom Powers.
We're very excited to be back with all of you. Before we begin the program, I'd like to acknowledge our main sponsors, without whose support this festival would not be possible. Thank you to our major sponsors, A&E Indie Films, Amazon Studios, HBO Documentary Films, History Films, and Netflix. To our supporting sponsors, Discovery, Image Nation Abu Dhabi, National Geographic Documentary Films, and Showtime Documentary Films. And our leading media sponsors, New York Magazine and WNET. I'd also like to take a moment and thank my incredible team for all the hard work they do each and every day. I am truly lucky to work with such a group of competent, dedicated, and just nice people. So I thank all of you. Now it's my pleasure to bring up to the stage my collaborator, artistic director, Tom Powers.
Thank you. November 9th. This is the day 1 year ago when we woke up to discover that Donald Trump was president. And when you run a film festival, it's going to start on that anniversary. You hope for something meaningful to share with an audience, and we couldn't think of a more meaningful film to be sharing with you tonight than the final year. I think at Doc NYC, we like to think about the tradition of documentary. When I think about the tradition of documentary, it takes me back to the early American pioneers of modern documentary in the 1960s. I'm talking about people like Robert Drew and D.A. Pennebaker and Albert Maysles. And one of the great films from those years in 1963 was a film called Crisis, where D.A. Pennebaker and his team got to film inside the White House as they were dealing with a crisis in Alabama, going up against Governor George Wallace. And it's an extraordinary document to see how those members of the White House team, including John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, were dealing with that. In 1963, it was a kind of shocking thing to see that in the White House. And I think on the front page of the New York Times, they said this is a terrible thing that cameras were let into the White House. And that was in 1963, and now here, some 50 more years later, cameras have never really been let in the White House again for that kind of vivid, candid treatment. Until now, director Greg Barker managed this extraordinary access, not only in the White House, but on the road with these great foreign policy advisors that we're going to meet in this film. Director Greg Barker has a long career making documentaries, some for the prestigious Frontline series on PBS. His films also include Sergio and We Are the Giant and Legion of Brothers. And we are very pleased to be showing to you for the first time in New York City his film, The Final Year. Please welcome Greg Barker.
Thank you, Tom. John, Julie, just come up here quickly. So, my producers, John Batsek and Julie Goldman. I cannot imagine two more demanding, inspiring, creative partners than these two people who've really been at my side for pretty much the past decade as we've made these films. So we're just thrilled to be here, to be screening this film. Tom and everyone from Doc NYC, thank you so much for all of your support. And it's really exciting for us to be screening it. You know, really, it's our first big screening in New York, really one of the first. We've had like two in the States up until now. So we're just getting ready to take this film out in the world. I want to thank Magnolia Pictures for their support. They're going to be releasing this film on January 19th, the day before a certain anniversary of a certain presidential inauguration. And then particularly our great friends from HBO Documentary Films who are here tonight, who were at our side from the very beginning, Nancy Abraham and Sheila Nevins. We literally could never have made this film without you. So thank you for your dedication, your friendship through this very eventful project. So we really deeply appreciate that. And just very briefly, there's a few members of my film team who are here. One who's one of our main editors, Langdon Page, who flew in from Chile, who's not actually seen the final version of the film yet. So Langdon, I hope you like it. Anything you don't, yeah. If you don't like, you can blame it on Josh, the other editor, because he did all those cuts. And Ann Rogers, our amazing coordinator, who made the whole film happen, plus so many other things. Chris Buchanan, our co-producer, who was with me at my side for this entire project, which involved filming in 21 countries over 15 months. Chris, I mean, you just handled the logistics and the personal relationships in a way that nobody else could at all. And finally, Diane Becker, our co-producer, who made everything run on time and brought us in basically on budget, remarkably, which was kind of extraordinary. So there's going to be some interesting, there's a lot of people in the film, in the audience here who I think worked for the Obama administration, and a couple of whom are going to join us from the film up here on stage afterwards, so please stick around for that discussion. I don't want to say much more about the film, except for the next 90 minutes, Donald Trump is no longer president.
Greg, let me start with you. You had previous connection to Samantha Power, and that your earlier film Sergio was based on her book about Sergio de Mello. Was that a help in getting entree to this, or was that a coincidence?
No, I mean, it wasn't a coincidence. I mean, I had a meeting with Samantha, over 2 years ago, the summer of 2015, to first discuss this project. And clearly that, personal connection helped, although I hadn't seen her in a few years. And, I think she was intrigued but skeptical. Her staff thought it was a largely terrible idea. And as a matter of fact, there's a guy here who worked for her team on the press side who at one point told me this was the most ridiculous, hardest idea he had ever heard in his entire career in government, and for that reason, he was going to help us make it happen. Curtis, yes, yes. Thank you, Curtis. And then, I had initial conversations and went to see Ben, who I'd had some interactions with on a previous film called Manhunt. But it gave me probably an entree, but it didn't sort of make it easy to happen at all. I mean, what do you think, Ben? It was quite a process to make this.
Yeah, it took a little while, Greg. Yeah.
Well, what were the calculations going on in your head, Ben, when you bring a camera crew into a world like that?
Well, you're initially, you keep it at arm's length, and it seemed like a strange idea. But, we decided to participate, but I think as Greg will attest, at first I was kind of a skeptic, and a couple things happened. I mean, one is, as we started to get later in the final year, I would, as you see in the film, spend all this time preparing to do a press briefing that seemed very important that day. And yet I started to realize, well, nobody's going to remember the press briefing I gave on June 2nd, 2016. But this could actually be a record that survives and that people could view, next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And suddenly the thing that seemed like the least important thing I had to do that day, allowing these guys access, felt more relevant than these kind of fleeting moments that I knew were going to run out. The other thing is, watching the episode I had with the New York Times Magazine piece, it worked out so well. I actually really reflected on that, and that's right about the time that Greg was really pushing. And I realized that there are two ways to respond to something like that, to recoil or to give more access. If you feel like you've been burned by access, usually people recoil. I felt the opposite. I thought, that wasn't me. Let's let these people follow me around. And actually, if I'm going to complain about the media, which I did on occasion there, a documentary filmmaker is someone who's going to show nuance. If my problem is that people don't understand what we're really trying to do here, then I have a responsibility to let people see what we're trying to do.
Rumana, I'd like to ask you what it's like for you to watch this film, this year of history that you lived through, compressed into 90 minutes.
Well, I can say the whole process of making it was definitely odd at times. But by the end, after the election, to echo Ben, it kind of made you realize how important it was to document this as a reminder and actually tonight was a little bit, it was bitter, but it was also sweet to be reminded of what was possible. And I think for especially younger generations who haven't had that inside view, for them to be able to see a lot of the young people that were in the room, that were in the building, Ben included, and all the advisors that were there, who are not old, crippling individuals. Not everybody.
Feels that way.
But it kind of gives that perspective that it is achievable. And I think especially the ending of capturing the raw emotions that we were feeling. I mean, there were days of tears for me that Ben saw. But I'm reminded sitting here and watching this today of what we did and what we can come back to doing, and the pendulum will swing back.
So, Rumana, some people may recognize your name because you recently wrote a piece in The Atlantic about your experiences. We see Ben and Samantha packing their bags in January, but you were contracted to stay on for several months into the new administration. And can you talk about what that contrast of, which you wrote about in The Atlantic, can you talk about what that contrast of experiences was like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I could have stayed on through, June 2018, which is when my contract would have ended. And I chose to stay knowing, having those doubts and having those fears, understanding the reality. There were still some things that I was able to work on. One of the things that I got to work with Ben on was Cuba. And you kind of hold on to that little bit of hope that some of the things that we did work on could continue potentially. And you always have to hold on to hope to have that impetus to keep moving forward. And that's why I stayed on. But as I think everyone knows and will remember, within that first week after January 20th, the speed at which all these different policies were being rolled out was terrifying. It was shocking. I mean, we all said that we kind of knew what to expect, but the reality of it actually hitting that quickly was quite different. And, for me, I never in a million years would have imagined to be allowed to have a voice in the White House. And people like Ben gave me that opportunity. And it kind of became like non-existent completely afterwards. So it was a complete polar opposite of the reality that I had lived for 5.5 years under the Obama administration.
Then Rumana mentioned Cuba, which was a passion of yours, as we see in the film. In recent days, we've heard new decision making going around Cuba, and I wonder if you can reflect on what's happening now.
Well, I mean, basically, the Trump administration has steadily rolled back our opening to Cuba. Most recently, with some announcements they made yesterday, limiting travel and business opportunities for Americans in Cuba, down to telling you certain brands of soda that you're not allowed to drink in Cuba, certain hotels you're not allowed to stay at. The irony is that they announced these policies to further sanction the Cuban government under the guise of support for human rights the same day that Donald Trump was in China, praising Xi Jinping for his remarkable political victory when the Politburo in China had recently handed Xi another term. So I have to say that it's, number one, frustrating because of the hypocrisy. I mean, they don't even try to, there's a lot of hypocrisy in American politics. These guys don't even try to kind of pretend that this is about anything other than some pretty narrow political interests of their own. The second thing that bothers me about it, that Rumana can attest to, is that the Cuban people were extraordinarily hopeful about the opening. I think the only poll that was conducted while we were in office showed that 97% of Cubans supported the opening. And yet it's their name that is invoked to justify these policies. And that's offensive to me. Why are we speaking on behalf of people who we refuse to listen to? Because they think that we should be engaging them instead of putting up walls around them, quite literally. And for me, it's difficult because I know that the people I worked with, even in the government, put their necks out to do this. It wasn't an obvious choice for them. Easy to have the United States be the permanent enemy. And I don't know what's going to happen to those people. It's probably not going to be good. So there's no way to really sugarcoat it. I like to think that we broke a certain psychological barrier in opening things up to Cuba. I know that we made certain things happen that wouldn't have otherwise happened. A very brief reference is made in that film to the Colombia Peace Agreement, which was negotiated in Havana. That wouldn't have happened without U.S. participation. So I still believe that that was the right thing, obviously, to do. But there are consequences to elections, and what is happening in Cuba is a consequence of that election.
I'm going to take questions from the audience. We have a microphone down here that I'll ask Rachel to set up, and if you want to come ask a question, just come line up down here. But Greg, while we're waiting for some people to come take questions, all of us in 2016 were expecting one outcome of the election. We'd check our New York Times phone app every day, and it would say, Hillary Clinton has an 85% chance of winning this election. We can see that even people who are much closer to information than I think I am were feeling the same way. In the making of this film, you must have been expecting that this film was going to be coming out in a different climate. How much were you thinking about that, and how did it affect the film once you realized that it was going a different way?
Yeah, Greg didn't let us in on the twist ending when
Yeah.
he pitched this
Yeah,
film.
I had known that all along. So yeah, man, Samantha that night, she sends her best wishes. She's in Ireland giving a speech. Otherwise, she'd be here. But that night was kind of obviously nobody anticipated what was going to happen. I think, but to me at least, it became clear hanging out with these guys over the course of the year, and that yeah, I could sense that the film was kind of becoming not just about their last year and their legacy. It was about that. It was also about like how we view the world as Americans, how we project ourselves into the world, and so I sort of take it in a couple ways. It's like the reassurance that that they constantly give that we're kind of like it's going to be okay. I mean, I think it's safe to say they missed it, right? We all missed it. But also I think that had Hillary won, we were going to. My sense was the end of the film would be about the nature of our democracy, and how close we came to electing an authoritarian leader. And for instance, the speech in Greece at the end, where Obama gives a speech indoors and then goes to the Parthenon. Actually, my understanding was that the speech was going to be outdoors at the Parthenon, on the steps of the Parthenon, about democracy, perhaps pointing out Russia, perhaps a lot of what we now know about the Russian influence in the election was going to come out then. So I think it would have been about the nature of our democracy, but obviously with a different ending. So, but it already felt like that this year was kind of, the film was inhabiting this space that, was much sort of deeper than we imagined going into it. I mean, when we began production, like over 2 years ago, Sheila Nevin said to me, like, it's great, but how do we know anything's going to happen? And I said, we don't. We'll just be around and hopefully something will. But, wasn't what we exactly hoped for, but things happened.
I think there's a gentleman here to take a question. We also have a microphone down here if anyone wants to come up and line up. So Go ahead.
Yeah, this question is for Ben. I know that you stress that the world is a lot bigger than the Middle East, and I know that you've also thought a lot about the region. So I'd like to ask, what do you think will happen first? The first American diplomat enters Tehran, or the last American soldier leaves Iraq?
Well, what will happen first? I mean, look, the reality is the course we were on, it would have been the first American diplomat entering Tehran. I think that was a trajectory that we were on, even if it was going to take a long time. I still think that will happen first. The point that we tried to lift up a bit in the film, that I did at least, is that we tend to start these wars without thinking through how and when they will end. I was 23, as I said, and living here in New York when I moved down to Washington after 9/11 to kind of be a part of that response. It seems like forever ago. It was 16 years ago. If you had told me then that we were going to respond by invading and occupying Iraq, and that we would still be there 15 years later, I would not have believed that. But I think that that what I saw in government is when you set the U.S. government in motion militarily in a foreign country, there's always a rationale to keep troops in the country where you send them. And that, frankly, that's been the model of American military intervention post-World War II, with the exception of Vietnam, when literally we had to airlift the people off the embassy. Unfortunately, I do think that the American military presence in Iraq is going to be a feature of our engagement in the Middle East for a long time. But I also know that the underlying challenges in the region require diplomatic resolution. These are not conflicts that will burn out absent addressing the underlying issues of the Saudi-Iranian proxy war across the region, the sectarian conflicts across the region, and doing that absent any engagement with Iran, unless we're willing to go to war in Iran, is not feasible. So, so I still think that will happen first.
There's a question right here.
I'm just curious, looking back, I know that 2020 is, nice to have, but would there be anything you would do differently regarding Syria and the current refugee crisis? I mean, if you could do anything, what would it be? And I know that we're not all in positions of government, and we're really more in positions of giving people a voice, but like whose voices, do you think that we should be really seeking out at this time?
So first of all, one of the things that in terms of both voices and the refugee crisis, and I'll get to Syria, but a place where I feel like there's not enough attention is Yemen. There's horrific humanitarian crisis in Yemen right now, this kind of Saudi-led war, which the U.S., at least under us, we would try to restrain the Saudis. We would temporarily suspend arms provisions. We would try to broker a political resolution. We saw the direction it was headed. In retrospect, that's the type of thing that, knowing that there wasn't going to be continuity with the new administration, we should have done more, because you could see the complete lack of strategic forethought in what the Saudis were doing and the moral implications, and I think that's going to spawn even greater instability and refugee flows in the region. And so the voices of the people of Yemen, who often are overlooked because of just other crises in the region, or other countries that are more prominent in kind of the Western media, I think get a bit lost. So I think both in terms of providing a voice in a place where we could have done more, I'd look at Yemen. I think on Syria, look, we will look at this for the rest of our lives. As someone who went through an evolution that I describe in the film of actually being more activist and more inclined towards military intervention earlier in the administration, before feeling like I had some sense of the impractical nature of making a positive difference there. What I look back on actually is early, at the very beginning, the diplomatic opportunities that could have been pursued more aggressively. It's interesting. It's always framed as should you have bombed the country at this point, or should you have armed more people earlier, as if those things work. And I actually, really believe that the track record demonstrates that they tend to not work. So I look back at 2011 and 2012, whether there was a more kind of full court press diplomatic effort that might have been able to forestall some of the more extreme bloodshed. That is not usually how the debate is framed when people look back. It's always like, should Obama bombed, in August of 2013? I think that there's a very interesting question of like, what would a more effective diplomatic initiative have looked like at the front end of this? Because if all we do when we look at crises that have taken place, if the only way we think about them is, well, what if we had gone to war there, then that's what we're going to do next time. And I actually think we have to be evaluating, well, were there other tools that we could have used more effectively at an earlier time?
I mean, I would just say the reason that it's in the film so prominently, Syria, is because, Secretary Kerry was working on it, and that gave a narrative thread. At the beginning of the year, he said, I'm going to try to, resolve this before I leave. But also, I think in my own experience, having made a film a long time ago about the genocide in Rwanda and the American response or lack of response, I just knew from talking to officials who in power back then that, with respect, this is a situation that's going to haunt this team for the rest of their lives. And so I just felt like it had to be at the. And I also, the third thing I'd say, and this is hard to convey and hard to understand if you haven't been in power, and so, but just the number of issues that they are dealing with at any one time sort of overwhelms the system. And that's not an excuse, but I think it is a reality, is that, as they're deciding whether or not to do more in Syria in those early days, it's got a lot of other things on the plate. And so any one issue becomes just harder to kind of actually, see through to the very end. And who knew it was going to happen? But I felt very strongly that I wanted it right at the core of the.
I think it's
of the
something
film.
that's very well conveyed in this film. That
so,
we,
yeah.
we don't always.
It's that human dynamics. Like, I mean, we can disagree, but we also have to ask ourselves, could we have done any better in those circumstances at that time? I mean, and we can all have our own answers to that.
We can take one more audience question here.
I think one of the things about the Trump administration that scares us the most is how it's attacking institutions and what effect that will have for legacy, really, and whether it's the press or the courts. And just wanted to speak to how you think that those institutions are faring and what we can all be doing to make sure that those get propped up and those remain in their checks and balances role.
Yeah, so, it's an incredibly important question. I'd talk about the institution of the U.S. Department of State. The Trump administration has almost kind of willfully emptied out the State Department. They're not filling, there's 0 assistant secretaries of state who are in place, the people who actually kind of lead our diplomacy. The Foreign Service, there's a mass exodus. They're cutting the budget of the Department of State. And it's hard to fully appreciate the consequences of that. And let me just give a few examples. The film shows Samantha turning up in Chad and Cameroon, and if we're not showing up there, we, the United States, nobody else is. We really do play this role of organizing the international community to deal with problems like that. And so right now, nobody's showing up. Everybody focuses rightly on North Korea and Iran and these front burner issues where it's hard to discern what they're doing and easy to fear that there's going to be a potential military conflict that could be catastrophic. But around the margins of the international community, what I look at is places that U.S. mobilization of others would make a difference. In Myanmar, a country I worked on a lot, we had in 2012 and 2015 circumstances flare up in Rakhine State, and the United States had to mobilize the UN and with Southeast Asian countries, and we had to send senior officials to Rakhine State. And right now, that hasn't happened, and we see an ethnic cleansing taking place. In Kenya, there's a similar risk of ethnic violence after an election. These types of issues that aren't at the front of mind for us, absent U.S. mobilization of the rest of the world to deal with them, things just don't happen. And frankly, in addition to us not being there, I feel like the worst actors in the world are feeling like there's a signal of this is your time. This is your time to make your move. Trump is going to go to the Philippines and meet with a leader who brags about extrajudicial killing. He will carry out more of those extrajudicial killings as a consequence. So as an institution, I worry about American diplomacy, which is what this film is about. I hope what this film does is galvanize people to want to do these jobs, probably in the next administration. But there will be a need to restock the cohort of American diplomats to go back out there to these places and fix these problems, which are going to get worse, frankly, in the next few years. On the civil society question, I think thus far, you have seen the media play a robust role. You have seen the courts step up in some circumstances. Congress a little bit less so. But I think, I do think that a role for Americans in insisting that the threat of Trump not be reduced to the triviality of whatever he tweeted, but actually paying attention to these deeper institutional norms that need to be withstand these next few years. That is going to depend upon very active citizens who are watching things very carefully, and in addition to registering to vote, so that we can can change the crowd that's in power. And I would just hope that people don't lose sight of the international perspective of that. Because people around the world are looking at us right now, and they're not just looking at Trump, they're looking at the country that elected Trump. You know, when I visit countries now, they say, you know, it's not just going to be enough to elect someone different in 2020. The doubts about American leadership come from the fact that Trump was elected, not just the fact of Trump. And so I think those people need to see the different America. They need to see that this is not representative of who we are. And so I think that does require, you know, people, you know, putting more of a premium on what they're doing to be active citizens.
If I can also add, actually, on a domestic front, one of the big reasons why I was terrified when I stayed under the Trump administration was seeing how, for me, most closely was the Office of Public Engagement wasn't getting filled. And public engagement was something that I did in my former role, but it's also what we did in the National Security Council. And what was so critical about the function of these public engagement offices across agencies is that it's what brought people together or tied them together to work together despite their differences. And the fact that none of those exists right now or aren't filled is concerning. However, you have all these individuals and organizations that are stepping up, and I think that's a really big and important way that we make sure that we fill this void, this temporary void, hopefully. Like, for example, just a few weeks ago, the Women's Convention, you know, they're still kind of continuing that tradition and that importance of empowering individuals and making sure that they are staying active, that they're staying involved, and that they're staying connected so that hopefully come, you know, the next election cycle, despite those offices having stayed void for these few years, we can get back and kind of start off where we left off.
Greg, you want to say some thank yous?
Yeah, it's just, you know what, I'm going to just quickly, Martina Radwan, our DP, came in late, and I just want to acknowledge her as one of our main DPs. Phenomenal work, wherever you are, Martina. And then I also want to just quickly thank the kind of the mid-level people within the government who made this happen. One of them is up here. I'll get to Rumana in a second. I want to thank Desiree Barnes, who was at the press office of the White House. You see her all the time in the film. She's like, whenever, it's just the first time she saw it, I want to know what you think, Desiree, afterwards. She's come to like 3 screenings and not sat through any of them, just kind of sneaks out, so you finally watched it. I want to know what you think. And every time we needed to like find Ben Rhodes somewhere, she's like, I get you through the security lines or get to the president, and amazing, couldn't have done it without you.
On the Ben Rhodes thing too, I'd just like to thank my wife who's here. What the film doesn't show is the spouses who put up with us sitting in the office at 9 o'clock. So for putting up with 8 years of that, you know, I just wanted, I wanted to slide in a thank you.
Perfect.
Greg.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And you had your second child like days before the leaving office, right?
January 3rd.
Yeah, amazing. And that's my daughter's. That's Anna's birthday, too, January 3rd. Anyway, Marie Harf from the State Department, who was like our main person with John Feiner to get to Secretary Kerry, and the number of times I was haranguing Marie, so thank you for your patience and for having faith in this project. Becca Wexler, who was Samantha Power's sort of main sort of, I don't know what your title was, but she was with Samantha day in, day out from like the very first, literally when they woke up in the morning until the end of the day. Becca, I don't know how you did it, but you were at our side all the way, including, I might add, that horrible day in Cameroon with the accident when we were in the same vehicle together. So thank you for everything along the way. Graham Brookie from the National Security Council, who was Ben had assigned as our main liaison. Sort of, I don't know what you did wrong, but for some reason you got that job. And daily haranguing Graham, saying we need more, we need more, we need more. And finally, I'm sure I'm leaving other people out, but everybody who was involved with it, thank you so much. And finally, Rumana for just being there for us and delivering and having faith in this project. And I was just so clear, when we were talking earlier, I was thinking about that one time, I think it was in Laos, where you came up to us and were just like, you know, Ben's not really comfortable having cameras around, I think you'd said. Just like, that's the whole premise of the film. And I said, I need to sit down with Ben and we need to talk about it. And so we had to kind of like...
It was my excuse to duck from the cameras myself as well. didn't work apparently.
And we had a heart-to-heart, and we kind of, it was a hard process, I think,
A couple
all around.
guys in the Bangkok airport, having a
Yes.
heart-to-heart about cameras. Yeah.
And so, and to you, Ben, and everybody at the principal level for trusting us. And we hung out a lot, and there's always this kind of tension as a filmmaker and the subject, and that's inherent to any project. But as I always say, every film requires a leap of faith, and thank you for taking that leap and trusting us with your story.
So in the case of the final year, it's not only our opening night film, it is part of our shortlist section. That is the section where we pick the 15 films that impressed us the most this year, and we hope are going to go very far. I can't think of another film that I more want the rest of the country to see than the final year. As Greg mentioned before, it's going to be coming out in theaters in January, so I hope
And on HBO in May or June, yeah.
I hope you'll spread the word about it. We've got 7 more days of films at our festival. If you are interested in international stories, we have a section called International Perspectives and other international stories throughout the festival. I want to thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to the team behind the final year.